Welcome to Linguistics Tube. On this channel, you will find videos about learning English, as well as more scientific videos about linguistics and psychology, and more general academic topics such as study skills, conducting research, and writing academic articles. This episode is part of my series which explores the grammar of English. We will learn about all the major types of words, phrases, and clauses, as well as other interesting grammatical phenomena. Through these episodes, you will not only learn the theory of English grammar, but also practical tips and advice about how to improve your grammatical ability in English. In this episode, we will explore a common type of clause called a relative clause. Here is the structure of this episode. Firstly, I'll introduce this type of clause. Then, we'll look at the four main types of relative clause in terms of their form. After that, we'll learn how to fully describe relative clauses. Next, we'll look at the two types of relative clause in terms of their function. Finally, we'll look at a few more details about relative pronouns. I like to begin these episodes with an introductory activity or some interesting questions. So let's do both. It's true that relative clauses exist in, presumably, every language, but the grammar of them is often very different. Let's compare the world's two most widely spoken languages, English and Chinese, as their relative clauses are constructed very differently. We will begin with a translation activity. If you speak Chinese, then this will be easy. If not, then you can either use Google Translate to help you, or simply allow me to talk you through the activity. It will still be interesting, even if you don't know Chinese. Okay, here is the activity. You will firstly see a Chinese sentence. Then, pause the video and translate it into English. Continue the video when you are ready. Through this, you will see all the main types of relative clause and experience the ways that they are different between the two languages. In both the Chinese and English sentences, the relative clause is underlined. After this, you will be fully prepared on the concept of relative clauses and ready to learn about the grammar of them in detail. Let's get started. Here is the English translation. I know a foreigner who teaches English grammar. I also know the students whom the foreigner teaches. The foreigner who teaches English grammar likes teaching his students. The students whom the foreigner teaches likes his lessons. I know a foreign teacher whose name is James. He is the foreign teacher whom I chatted to, or whom I talked to. From this, we can see two big differences in the position of relative clauses. Firstly, whenever the relative clause is in the middle of the Chinese sentence, it is at the end of the English sentence. And whenever it is at the beginning of the Chinese sentence, it is in the middle of the English sentence. Secondly, the Chinese relative clause is always before a noun, whereas the English version is always after a noun. Thus, we can conclude that the relative clauses between the two languages could not be more different. Now for 3 questions that I would like you to think about now. You do not need to answer them yet, as I would like to prepare you for the kinds of topics that we'll explore in this episode. Thus, by the end of this episode, the answers will become clear. Firstly, what's the difference between "that's the person to whom I talked" and "that's the person whom I talked to"? Secondly, is the word who only for people? Therefore, is it incorrect to say "a dog who makes us laugh" instead of "a dog which makes us laugh"? Thirdly, which of these 2 sentences is easier to learn? I met a man who had a cat. The man whom I met had a cat. And finally, is there a difference between these 2 sentences? My friend who's Japanese is coming. My friend who's Japanese is coming. Now that you're prepared for the phenomenon of relative clauses, let's define them. Let's begin with a definition and outline of what relative clauses actually are. In terms of their form, relative clauses in English are always positioned after a noun phrase, and they are connected to this noun phrase. In terms of function, they add more detail about the entity in that noun phrase, which could be something concrete like a person or a thing, or something abstract like a concept or an idea. At this point, relative clauses should sound similar to something else we've learned about before in this series. They are next to nouns and add more detail to the noun. That is essentially the definition of an adjective. Yes, relative clauses are conceptually the same as adjectives, which is why another name for relative clause is adjective clause. However, relative clause is the more commonly used name, so I will continue to use that. To demonstrate the functional similarity of relative clauses to adjectives, please compare the following 2 sentences. We need a better book. We need a book which is better. Do you agree that both of them have the same meaning? Please pause the video if you need more time to think about it. Let's explore the similarities and differences between adjectives and relative clauses. Firstly, the adjective better in the sentence "we need a better book" and the relative clause "which is better" in the sentence "we need a book which is better" both add essentially the same information and detail about the noun book. You can learn more about the similarity between adjectives and relative clauses in the episode about adjectives. However, regarding the differences, there are 2 important ones. Firstly, in a typical sentence like "we need a better book," the adjective is directly before the noun. We learned about this type of adjective in a previous video. It is arguably the most common position for adjectives, and it is called an attributive adjective. However, even though these 2 sentences have the same meaning, relative clauses are always directly after the noun. This means that relative clauses contain another type of adjective that we previously learned about, a predicative adjective, because there are a few words between the noun and the adjective. The second major difference is that the information in the sentence, "We need a better book," is in one clause. By this, I mean the noun and the adjective, the modifier and the word being modified, are in one group of words. Remember that a clause is a group of words that contains a verb, whereas a group of words that does not contain a verb is called a phrase. In contrast, the information in the sentence, "We need a book which is better," is in two clauses. Firstly is the main clause. This is the clause which could exist on its own as a separate sentence, and it contains the noun, which is the word being modified. In our example, it is, "We need a book." Secondly is the relative clause. This cannot exist on its own, so it must be connected to a main clause in order to become a grammatical sentence. It contains the adjective, which is the modifier. In our example, it is the clause, "which is better." Overall, then, because of these two differences, we can conclude that adjectives and relative clauses have the same function, but a very different form. Let's discuss the form of relative clauses in more detail. Remember that the form of a word is its structure and physical shape. Most of the time, relative clauses start with a relative pronoun. We have discussed other types of pronouns so far in this course, but not relative pronouns. The relative pronoun in the sentence, "We need a book which is better," is which, because this is the first word of the relative clause. There are several more relative pronouns. Can you think of them? To help you, look again at the examples in the activity at the start of this video. As you can see, there are several relative pronouns in English. The 5 most common ones are in the following sentences, and we will see the other, less frequent ones at the end of this episode. The relative pronouns are underlined, and they are at the start of the relative clause. The word immediately before the relative pronoun is the noun that the relative clause modifies. I'll now read the sentences. I'm the kind of person who is always losing things. It's a brand new book which I bought last week. It's for a class with a teacher whom I really like. She's the first teacher whose classes I actually look forward to. I can't find a book that I need for school. Let's now discuss the grammatical construction of a relative clause. To do this, I must introduce a term that might be new to you: antecedent. This term relates to the relationship between a noun and a pronoun. The antecedent of a pronoun is the noun that the pronoun refers to. I can best explain this with an example. In the sentence, "I dislike James because he is a boring teacher," we have the pronoun he. He refers to James, because both James and he refer to the same entity, or the same thing. Therefore, James is the antecedent of he. He is a personal pronoun, but all types of pronoun have antecedents, including relative pronouns. The relative pronoun is always after the antecedent. It is the noun phrase in the main clause that the relative pronoun refers to. In our previous example, "We need a book which is better," the antecedent of the relative pronoun is a book. To demonstrate this relationship more clearly, we can turn the main clause and the relative clause into 2 full sentences. In other words, 2 main clauses. The first full sentence used to be the main clause, and the second sentence used to be the relative clause. This means that the second full sentence must now contain a full noun phrase instead of a relative pronoun. This noun phrase used to be the relative pronoun in the relative clause, so it is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. It will be the same noun as the antecedent in the main clause. When these two full sentences are then combined back into a main clause and a relative clause, the noun phrase in the second sentence, that is the antecedent of the relative pronoun, becomes the relative pronoun in the relative clause. Through this, we can understand how relative clauses are constructed, and also the relationship between the main clause and the relative clause. Let's now look at an example of this. Let's start with the main clause and the relative clause. I saw the man who was here. The main clause is I saw the man, so let's now call that the first full sentence. The relative clause is who was here. The relative pronoun in the first example is underlined. We can work out that the real noun that the relative pronoun refers to is the man, because it is the man who was here. Therefore, the second full sentence is the man was here. These two sentences together, I saw the man was here, have the same meaning as I saw the man who was here. Thus, you can now see that the relative pronoun refers to one of the nouns in the second full sentence, and we now know which noun in the second full sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. The antecedent is underlined, so we can see that the man and who refer to the same entity. There are two broad categories of relative clause, which depends on whether the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the subject or the object of the relative clause when it is converted into the second full sentence. Don't worry if you are still confused, because we will see many examples now. We will explore these two types of relative clause in detail now. Also, there are two additional types of relative clause, which are either types of subject relative clause or object relative clause. Therefore, we can say that there are four types of relative clause: subject relative clause, object relative clause, after preposition relative clause, and possessive relative clause. Because we will learn about the form and function of relative clauses, I will briefly repeat my earlier definition. Form and function are two ways to analyze the grammar of a word, phrase, or clause. Its form refers to its physical shape and structure. In contrast, the function of a word, phrase, or clause refers to its meaning. When learning about aspects of grammatical phenomena in detail, it's necessary to fully understand both their form and function in order to have a well-rounded understanding of it. Let's now look at four types of relative clause. These types are based on the form of the relative clauses. We'll start with the most straightforward type of relative clause, the subject relative clause. To understand the grammar of this type of relative clause, we can perform the process we just learned about. Thus, let's separate the main plus relative clauses into two full separate sentences. When we combine the two sentences into a main clause and a relative clause, the subject of the second full sentence, which is a full noun phrase, becomes the relative pronoun in the relative clause. Thus, in this type of relative clause, the subject of the second full sentence, which is the relative clause sentence, is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. This is why it's called a subject relative clause. Importantly, it is not the subject of the first full sentence, that is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. It is always only the second full sentence that contains the antecedent of the relative pronoun when it becomes the relative clause. At this point, we are not talking about which noun the relative clause modifies in the main clause. That is a separate aspect of the grammar of relative clauses, so we will discuss that in the next section. Thus, here we are only discussing whether the subject or the object of the second full sentence becomes the antecedent of the relative pronoun. And in this type, it is the subject. In this type of relative clause, who and which are the relative pronouns. Here is an example. In sentence A are the two full sentences. I saw the man was here. The subject of the second sentence is underlined. When converted into a main clause and a relative clause, I saw the man who was here, the subject of the second sentence becomes the relative pronoun who. Thus, the two underlined words in sentence A and sentence B refer to the same entity. So the man is the antecedent of who. Here is another example. The two full sentences are in C. I took the book was on the table. The antecedent of the relative pronoun is the book, which is the subject of the second full sentence. Converting it into a main clause plus relative clause transforms the subject of the sentence into the relative pronoun which. I took the book which was on the table. This means that the book and which both refer to the same entity, so the book is the antecedent of which. Regarding the choice of relative pronouns, I have a question for you. What is the difference between who and which? When do we use who, and when do we use which? Pause the video if you need more time to answer this question. From these examples, we can deduce that who is used for people and which is used for objects. In fact, another relative pronoun can be used in these two sentences, but only in informal English. It is the relative pronoun that. For example, I saw the man that was here. I took the book that was on the table. When speaking, the relative pronoun that is often used instead of who and which, but I don't recommend its use in writing. The reason for that will become clear near the end of this episode. Now on to the next type of relative clause, the object relative clause. In this type, the object of the second full sentence, which is the relative clause sentence, is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. Importantly, it is not the object of the first full sentence that is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. It is always only the second full sentence that contains the antecedent of the relative pronoun when it becomes the relative clause. Remember, it is a separate issue whether the relative clause modifies the subject or the object of the main clause. We'll discuss that soon. For this type, whom and which are the object relative pronouns. Like with the subject relative clauses, whom is used when the antecedent is human, and which is used for non-human antecedents. Here is an example. The two full sentences are, I liked the woman, I met the woman. The first sentence is the main clause, and the second sentence becomes the relative clause. The object of the second sentence, which is underlined, becomes the underlined relative pronoun in the relative clause. I liked the woman whom I met. Here is another example. I liked the film. I saw the film. The object of the second sentence, the film, becomes the relative pronoun which in the relative clause. I liked the film which I saw. So, both which and the film refer to the same entity. Interestingly, the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the object of the second full sentence. Thus, it is after the subject and verb, because English word order is subject, verb, object. However, when the two sentences are converted into a main clause and a relative clause, the object moves to the beginning of the relative clause, because relative pronouns are always at the start of a relative clause. This means that the subject and verb are now after the relative pronoun, which used to be the object. Thus, the word order of an object relative clause is very different from a subject relative clause. Regarding the choice of relative pronouns, in addition to whom and which, that can also be used as an object relative pronoun in the same manner as subject relative clauses. For example, it sounds perfectly acceptable in speech to say, I liked the woman that I met, and I liked the film that I saw. However, like before, I do not recommend the use of that as a relative pronoun in writing, only in informal speech. In fact, if you want to be even more informal, then it is possible to use no object relative pronoun. Thus, it is perfectly grammatical to say, I liked the woman I met, and I liked the film I saw. So, grammatically, there should be a word here in order to make the sentence grammatical, but there is not. When analysing the grammar of the sentence, we do not say that there is no word here or that it is missing. Instead, we say that it is technically there, but it is invisible in this particular sentence. Therefore, the sentence is still grammatical even though our ears did not hear the word, or our eyes cannot see the word. This is an important concept in grammatical analysis. Thus, to represent this, we use the symbol that you can see in the two examples, a circle with a diagonal line through it. To reiterate, it means that, grammatically, the relative pronoun is still there, but it just happens to be invisible in this particular sentence. We do the same for plurals that are invisible on some words, like 3 sheep, as well as for past tense verbs, like I hit him yesterday. In these cases, the plural and past tense is technically there, but it happens to be invisible. We call these 0 plurals, 0 past tense, and 0 relative pronouns. The third type of relative clause that we'll learn about is called an after preposition relative clause. It is actually a special type of object relative clause. In this type, the noun phrase that is the antecedent of the relative pronoun, in other words, the noun phrase that becomes the relative pronoun, is inside a prepositional phrase. Remember that a prepositional phrase consists of a preposition plus a noun phrase, such as in bed or at the office. Therefore, it is called an after preposition relative clause because the noun phrase that becomes the relative pronoun is after a preposition. We know that this type of relative clause is always a type of object relative clause because prepositional phrases are always the object of a sentence, so they are never the subject of a sentence. You might be able to think of a sentence in which the prepositional phrase is at the start of a sentence. However, they are never the subject of the sentence.
Let's look at two examples. In the office is where you'll find him. Before the war was when they met. Here, even though the prepositional phrases are before the verb, they only provide the setting of the action, not key information about what happened or who did it. In fact, they can be more straightforwardly rephrased as, you'll find him in the office. They met before the war. Overall, this demonstrates that after preposition relative clauses are always object relative clauses, because prepositional phrases are never the subject of the sentence, only the object. So, it is the object of the second full sentence that becomes the relative pronoun in the relative clause. This means that whom and which are used when the second sentence, which becomes the relative clause, contains a prepositional phrase. In fact, there are two possible positions for the preposition in a relative clause. Compare these two examples. Which one is the most common? We'll start with two separate sentences to demonstrate the process of creating a main clause and relative clause. She is a person. You talk to that person. The noun phrase that will become the relative pronoun is underlined. Here are the two relative clauses. She is the person to whom you talked. She is the person whom you talk to. Thus, the preposition is to, and the noun phrase that person became whom, which is an object relative pronoun. Here is another example. This is a hotel. I stayed in this hotel. The prepositional phrase is in this hotel, and the noun phrase which will become the relative pronoun is this hotel. When converted into a main clause and relative clause, the two positions are this is the hotel in which I stayed, and this is the hotel which I stayed in. Which of these two positions, A and E, or C and F, are the most common? Hopefully you agree with me that the most common and natural sounding position is C and F, where the preposition is at the end of the sentence. Let's now explore these two positions in more detail. We can, in fact, give names to these two types of relative clause. On the previous screen, sentences B and E are called fronted preposition relative clauses. In this case, front means to move something to the front or start of something else. Thus, in this type of after preposition relative clause, the prepositional phrase remains intact, because the preposition has moved to the start of the relative clause along with the relative pronoun. It makes sense that the preposition would move when the relative pronoun moves, because the relative pronoun was originally the noun phrase inside the prepositional phrase, so they are one unit when they are in the second full sentence. In contrast, the other type of after preposition relative clause has a different position for the preposition. If you look back at sentences C and F, you will see that the preposition is after the verb. It is at the end of the sentence, even though the relative pronoun has moved to the start of the relative clause. Remember that it makes sense for them to stay together, because they were originally one unit as a prepositional phrase. Therefore, because the preposition has not been moved along with the relative pronoun, they have become separated. Let's explore this process in more detail. Keep in mind that the noun phrase in the original second full sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. So, the preposition plus noun phrase were originally next to each other in one prepositional phrase, but in this type of relative clause, they are no longer next to each other. This is because the relative pronoun has moved, whereas the preposition has stayed in its original position. In other words, the preposition is still after the verb, which is the same position as the original second full sentence. Let's give a name to this phenomenon. If the preposition is separated from the relative pronoun, it is called a stranded preposition. Therefore, this type of relative clause is called a stranded preposition relative clause. Now that we understand the workings of these two variations of the after preposition relative clause, let me ask you a question. Remember that in object relative clauses, that can be used instead of whom and which. Also remember that after preposition relative clauses are a type of object relative clause. Therefore, in fronted and stranded preposition relative clauses, can that be used instead of whom or which? Please pause the video and think about it, and continue when you have your answer. In fronted preposition relative clauses, that cannot be used instead of whom or which. Thus, it sounds very strange to say, "This is the hotel in that I stayed," instead of "This is the hotel in which I stayed." However, in stranded preposition relative clauses, it sounds perfectly fine to do this. Therefore, instead of "This is the hotel which I stayed in," you can certainly say, "This is the hotel that I stayed in." Seeing as we are asking about using that instead of whom or which, let's ask the same question for the zero relative pronoun phenomenon. So, bearing in mind that object relative clauses can have an invisible relative pronoun, such as "I enjoyed the film I saw," and bearing in mind that after preposition relative clauses are a type of object relative clause, can after preposition relative clauses also have an invisible relative pronoun? Please pause the video and work out the answer for both fronted and stranded after preposition relative clauses. Analogous to the situation for that, fronted preposition relative clauses cannot have a zero relative pronoun, whereas stranded preposition relative clauses can. Therefore, it is ungrammatical to say, "This is the hotel in I stayed," but it is fine to say, "This is the hotel I stayed in." You might be wondering why stranded preposition relative clauses are more flexible with regards to the relative pronoun than fronted preposition relative clauses. Pause the video and try to work out the answer yourself. It is likely because English is more flexible when the standard word order is maintained as much as possible. Look at the example on the screen. The stranded preposition relative clause is "I stayed in," which looks like typical English word order. But for the fronted preposition relative clause, the relative clause is "in I stayed." This is not typical English word order. Thus, when the word order is already manipulated from the most typical way to say something, as in the case of a fronted preposition relative clause, there is much less flexibility to change it further, such as by changing or removing words. The final thing to say about this type is that, as you already know, stranded preposition relative clauses are much more common than fronted preposition relative clauses, which are very formal and used in writing only. The The final type of relative clause is called a possessive relative clause. Its name comes from the type of pronoun that begins this type of relative clause. It's called a possessive pronoun. This type of pronoun shows that something belongs to someone. English has several possessive pronouns. There are different types depending on the grammar of the sentence. The most common are mine, yours, his, hers, ours, yours, theirs. However, whose is also a possessive pronoun. This is the only possessive pronoun that can begin a relative clause. You can see this in the following two examples. I will talk to the girl's bag was stolen. I will talk to the girl whose bag was stolen. I lived in a house. The roof of the house was leaking. I lived in a house whose roof was leaking. The construction of this relative clause is more complicated than the previous types. To demonstrate this, listen to this example, which does not contain a relative clause. This book is mine. If James owns the book, then mine refers to James. Or, in other words, James is the antecedent of mine. So, we can see that for all possessive pronouns, the antecedent of the possessive pronoun is an entity which owns something. We can also see that the possessive pronoun mine replaces the entire noun phrase. However, the relative clause possessive pronoun whose does not replace the entire noun phrase, unlike a non-relative clause possessive pronoun like mine or theirs. Instead, the antecedent of the relative pronoun whose is only a possessive word or phrase within the whole noun phrase. You can see this in the examples on the previous screen. The underlined words in A and C are not the entire noun phrase, but the part which shows who or what possesses the noun phrase. The entire noun phrase in A is the girl's bag. Only the possessive phrase, the girl's, becomes the antecedent of the possessive pronoun, so bag stays in the relative clause next to the pronoun. As you can see from the two examples on the previous screen, there are two ways to express possession in English: apostrophe s and a phrase beginning with of. To convert these into possessive relative pronouns, it is this possessive word or phrase that becomes the possessive relative pronoun. When it is apostrophe s, for example, the girl's, the word containing it becomes the possessive relative pronoun. And when it is the of phrase, for example, of the house, the entire phrase becomes the relative pronoun. When we convert the relative clause into two full sentences, the apostrophe s is always before the noun, whereas the of phrase is always after the noun. But when we convert the two full sentences into a relative clause, the possessive relative pronoun always moves to before the noun. Possessive relative clauses can either be a specific type of subject relative clause or object relative clause, depending on whether the possessive phrase is in the subject or object of the second full sentence. Compare these two examples. I like the restaurant. The restaurant's food is delicious. I like the restaurant whose food is delicious. Here, the noun phrase containing the possession is the subject of the second full sentence, so the apostrophe s phrase becomes the relative pronoun whose. Here is an object possessive relative clause. He always goes to the restaurant. He likes the restaurant's food. He always goes to the restaurant whose food he likes. Like with a standard object relative clause, the object of the second full sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. and even though the object was at the end of the sentence, the relative pronoun and noun move to the beginning of the relative clause. So the word order is object, subject, verb. But unlike a standard object-relative clause, only part of the object, the part containing the possession, becomes the relative pronoun. There is, in fact, another structure for possessive relative clauses, which uses different relative pronouns depending on whether the possessed entity is living or not living. For animate entities, it is possible to use of whom after the noun, instead of whose before the noun. Therefore, you can say the bag of whom instead of whose bag. Compare the two types here. I will talk to the girl whose bag was stolen. I will talk to the girl, the bag of whom was stolen. Similarly, for inanimate objects, it is possible to use of which after the noun instead of whose before the noun. Thus, you could say the roof of which instead of whose roof. You can see this in the two versions on the screen. I lived in a house whose roof was leaking. I lived in a house, the roof of which was leaking. As I'm sure you know, the whose structure is far more common than the of whom and of which structures, which should only be used in very formal writing. Before we continue, I would like to comment on a gradual change that is occurring in English with regards to relative pronouns. As you might have already realized, the object relative pronoun whom is dying in English. No one really knows why, but it is clear that many people use who in object relative clauses instead. So, grammatically, we should say, she isn't the woman whom I talked to. However, many people say, she isn't the woman who I talked to. Perhaps this sounds normal to you, as it does to many native speakers, but it is technically ungrammatical. Also, it is very common to use no object pronoun, as in, she isn't the woman I talked to. Or, it is common to use that instead of whom or who. She isn't the woman that I talked to. So, with all of these alternative options available, whom is struggling to survive. Today, it is rare to hear it in spoken English, instead being used mostly in formal texts only. We'll begin the next section after an activity. What type of relative clause is in these four sentences? 1. This is the friend whom I live with. 2. I bought the phone which I wanted. 3. I helped the boy whose phone was broken. 4. John ate the sandwich which had meat inside. Pause the video while you do this. One is an after preposition relative clause, because the two full sentences are, this is the friend, I live with the friend. With is the preposition, so the friend, which was inside the prepositional phrase, becomes the relative pronoun whom. 2 is an object relative clause, because the two full sentences are, I bought the phone, I wanted the phone. The object of the second sentence becomes the relative pronoun which. 3 is a possessive relative clause, because the part of the noun phrase which becomes the relative pronoun whose would be the boy's, as in the boy's phone. Finally, 4 is a subject relative clause, because the second full sentence is the sandwich had meat inside. So it is the subject that becomes the relative pronoun which. In the next section of this episode, we will add to our classifications of relative clauses by introducing another aspect of their grammatical construction, the nature of the relationship between the relative clause and the main clause. This will allow us to create a complete description of a relative clause. In the previous section, we explored the 4 ways in which the subject or the object of the second full sentence can become the relative pronoun. Or, in other words, we learned that the relative pronoun has an antecedent, and we now know how to identify it. Overall, we learned that this process creates different types of relative clause. In the next section, we will build upon this knowledge by going beyond an analysis of the inside of the relative clause and instead examine the different types of relationship that exist between relative clauses and main clauses. We said at the beginning of this episode that 2 separate pieces of information are put together to make a sentence which contains a main clause and relative clause. We can express these 2 pieces of information as 2 sentences. For example, the man has a cat. The man lives next door. To put them together into a sentence with a main clause and a relative clause, either the subject or the object of the second sentence becomes the relative pronoun in the relative clause. In this example, the subject undergoes this transformation. As we say, the man who lives next door has a cat. Looking more broadly at this sentence, we can see that the relative clause, which was the second sentence, is modifying the subject of the main clause, which was the first sentence. By modify, I mean that the relative clause is adding more information to the subject of the main clause, which in this case is the man. The relative clause is underlined. Here is another example to demonstrate this relationship. The woman has a dog. The man loves the woman. We can combine these 2 sentences into a main clause and relative clause. The woman whom the man loves has a dog. Again, the relative clause is underlined. Like with the previous example, the relative clause is modifying the subject of the main clause, which is the woman. So, regarding the position of the relative clause, we can conclude that if the relative clause modifies the subject of the main clause, it is always in the middle of the sentence. This is because it must be directly after the part of the sentence that it modifies, which here is the subject. Thus, it must be after the subject and before the verb and object. Look again at these 2 sentences, because there is something fundamentally different about them. This difference should be familiar to you, based on your knowledge of the previous section of this episode. Let me read them. The man who lives next door has a cat. The woman whom the man loves has a dog. 2 differences should immediately be obvious. Firstly, the first sentence uses who, whereas the second uses whom. Secondly, in the first sentence, the order in the relative clause is relative pronoun, verb, object, whereas in the second sentence, it is relative pronoun, subject, verb. So, we are definitely dealing with 2 different types of relative clause. Specifically, the first sentence contains a subject-relative clause, because the subject of the second full sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. Thus, the second full sentence was, the man lives next door. and the subject of this sentence became who. In contrast, the sentence in B contains an object relative clause, because the object of the second full sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. Specifically, the second full sentence was, "The man loves the woman," and it is the woman that becomes whom. In conclusion, in order to fully describe relative clauses, there are two different pieces of information. Using the example, "The man who lives next door has a cat," the first piece of information to include in our classification is what we just learned about. In this example, the relative clause modifies the subject of the main clause. This means that more information has been added to the man. Compare the sentence with and without the relative clause to demonstrate this. The man has a cat. The man who lives next door has a cat. By modifying the subject of the main clause with the relative clause, we know exactly which man is being referred to in the sentence. That's what I mean by more information has been added to the subject. Our concept of the man is more specific, because we have a clearer idea of which man is the focus of the sentence. The second piece of information that we need to fully describe a relative clause is what we learned about first in this episode. Using the same example, we need to state that the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the subject of the second full sentence. In other words, the second part of our classification is that the subject of the second full sentence becomes the relative pronoun in the relative clause. To exemplify this, we need to split apart the main clause and relative clause in our example into two separate sentences. So, "The man who lives next door has a cat" becomes "The man has a cat" and "The man lives next door." It is the subject of the second sentence, which is the man, that becomes the relative pronoun who. Now that we understand what is involved in our classification of relative clauses, we can put these two pieces of information together to give names to our full description of relative clauses. "The man who lives next door has a cat" is called a subject-subject relative clause, which I'll refer to as SS relative clause. The first subject refers to the first part of the classification, the connection between the relative clause and the main clause. Specifically, that the relative clause modifies the subject of the main clause. The second subject refers to the connection between the relative pronoun and the noun phrase in the second full sentence. Specifically, the subject of the original second sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. The second example we saw in this section is, "The woman whom the man loves has a dog." I can tell you that it is a subject-object, SO, relative clause. Please pause the video to work out why. The S is because the relative clause modifies the subject of the main clause. Specifically, we have a clearer idea of which woman the sentence refers to. The O refers to the fact that the relative pronoun's antecedent is the object of the original second full sentence, which was, "The man loves the woman." Specifically, the woman has become whom. The relative clauses that we have seen so far in this section were all in the middle of the sentence, but we saw relative clauses in the previous section that were at the end of the sentence. This different position for the relative clause is another type of relative clause, which we'll discuss now. Here is a simple example. "The man has a cat." The cat likes the dog. The man has a cat which likes the dog. When a relative clause is at the end of a sentence, the relative clause modifies the object of the main clause. Because of this, to describe the relationship between the relative clause and the main clause, the first part of our full classification must be O, or object. Therefore, there are two possible relative clauses in this type: object-subject, OS, or object-object, OO. Like before, the second part of the classification refers not to the relative clause-main clause relationship, but to whether the subject or object of the relative clause is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. In the sentence, "The man has a cat which likes the dog," the full classification of the relative clause is OS, because the subject of the second full sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. In other words, the cat in sentence B becomes which in sentence C. The final type of relative clause to discuss is when the relative clause modifies the object of the main clause and the object of the second full sentence is the antecedent of the relative pronoun. This is known as OO. For example, the woman has a dog. The cat likes the dog. The woman has a dog which the cat likes. The relative clause modifies a dog, because we know more clearly which dog is being referred to. Secondly, the object of sentence B is transformed into the relative pronoun which in the main clause. Therefore, there are four ways to fully describe relative clauses: SS, SO, OS, and OO. You can see a summary of this on the screen now. Please pause the video and have a quick look to ensure you understand the four complete descriptions. Let's do an activity to cement our knowledge of this section. You will see 4 sentences which contain relative clauses. You have 2 tasks. Firstly, find the relative clauses. Secondly, decide whether they are SS, SO, OS, or OO. Regarding the topic of the sentences, they are instructions about how to set up a computer. Before we get to the activity though, let's do a quick practice. In this sentence, "I only eat food which is delicious," where is the relative clause? The relative clause is which is delicious. Next, is the relative clause modifying the subject or the object of the main clause? It's the object because it is at the end of the sentence. Therefore, it is either OS or OO. Another method is to turn it into an adjective and see which noun it modifies. The sentence would be, "I only eat delicious food." Here, the adjective clearly modifies the object. Finally, is it OS or OO? It's OS because the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the subject of the second full sentence. I only eat food. The food is delicious. Another way to say this is that the object of the main clause, food, is the subject of the relative clause, the food is delicious. But it is easier to think of it using the explanation about antecedents. Here are the 4 sentences. The power cord which grounds the computer has 2 ends. Some screens have a port which you can connect the keyboard to. The keyboard has a port which is used for the mouse. The port which the mouse connects to is next to the keyboard. Please pause the video to work out the answers and then continue when you are ready. Here are the answers. The relative clauses are underlined. As two separate sentences, sentence 1 would be, the power cord has two ends. The power cord grounds the computer. Here, the relative clause modifies the subject of the main clause, and the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the subject of the second full sentence. So, it is SS. For sentence 2, as two separate sentences, it would be, some screens have a port. You can connect the keyboard to the port. Here, the relative clause modifies the object of the main clause, and the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the object of the second full sentence. Specifically, a port becomes which. So, it is OO. For sentence 3, as two separate sentences, it would be, the keyboard has a port. The port is used for the mouse. Here, the relative clause modifies the object of the main clause, and the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the subject of the second full sentence. So, it is OS. And finally, as two separate sentences, sentence 4 would be, the port is next to the keyboard. The mouse connects to the port. Here, the relative clause modifies the subject of the main clause, and the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the object of the second full sentence. Specifically, the port becomes which. Therefore, it is SO. Here is a final activity for this section. It is a translation activity. Please translate these Chinese sentences with relative clauses into English, and then decide whether they are SS, SO, OS, or OO. If you speak Chinese, then this will be easy. If not, then you can either use Google Translate to help you, or simply allow me to talk you through this activity. It will still be interesting even if you don't know Chinese. Pause the video now and complete this activity, and continue when you are ready. Sentence 1 translates as, the man who lives next door has a cat. I'll skip the explanation now because I don't want to repeat myself, but I hope you decided that it is SS. Next, the woman whom the man loves has a dog. This is SO. 3. The man has a cat which likes the dog. This is OS. 4. The woman has a dog which the cat likes. Is OO. We now know how to describe relative clauses in terms of their form, but everything in grammar can also be described in terms of its function. We will do that now with relative clauses and learn about the two types of relative clause in terms of their function.
As I just said, there are different ways to classify relative clauses. The method we've seen so far is based on the grammatical mechanism of the relative clause, and how it relates to the main clause in the sentence. In other words, the type of relative clause so far are based on their form. However, another way to classify relative clauses is based on the meaning it contributes to the sentence. In other words, we can also classify relative clauses based on their function in the sentence. In terms of function, there are two types: restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. So far, all the clauses we have looked at have been restrictive relative clauses. I will now explain the difference between them, along with lots of examples. At the beginning of this episode, I said that relative clauses function like adjectives, because they modify the noun phrase to which they are connected. When a restrictive relative clause modifies a noun phrase, it provides necessary information about the noun phrase. This means that the relative clause controls, restricts, or constrains the meaning of the noun phrase. If the relative clause is removed from the sentence, the fundamental meaning of the noun phrase will change. In other words, the noun phrase no longer has the same meaning if the relative clause is removed. There is a way to show that the relative clause is restrictive in speaking and writing. When speaking, we do not pause before or after a restrictive relative clause, and we do not write punctuation between it. Here are a few examples of restrictive relative clauses. The student who sits at the back of the room asks a lot of questions. The results which I obtained may cause changes at the university. The journalist whose story I read yesterday has won prizes for her work. Notice that, when I say them, I do not pause at the beginning and end. I won't explain the meaning of these particular examples, so at the end of this section of the episode, I recommend that you look back at these 3 sentences and try to work out their meanings, specifically in terms of whether they constrain the meaning of the noun phrase or not. Let's now look at the second type of relative clause, the non-restrictive relative clause. It is essentially the opposite of the restrictive type, because instead of adding essential information about the noun phrase, which determines the entity that the noun phrase refers to, a non-restrictive relative clause adds extra, additional, optional information to a noun phrase. This means that if this kind of relative clause is removed, the noun that it modified still has the same basic meaning, and you will still understand the basic meaning of the sentence. Thus, the noun was not constrained or limited by the relative clause, so its basic meaning is still intact. In terms of how to identify this type of relative clause, apart from understanding the context of the sentence, the way we write and speak non-restrictive relative clauses is different from restrictive relative clauses. In speaking, we usually pause before or after non-restrictive clauses, and when writing them, we usually separate the clause from the main clause with punctuation. You can see some examples of non-restrictive relative clauses here. The hypothesis, which I tested throughout the research, was rejected. I have found the article, which I have been looking for. Notice that, when I say them, I pause at the beginning and end. Again, I won't explain the meaning of these 2 examples now, so at the end of this section, I recommend that you look back at these 2 sentences and try to work out why these 2 relative clauses are non-restrictive. Now that we understand the basic difference between them and have seen some examples of the 2 types, here is a question for you. Look at the 2 sentences on the screen. Which sentence contains the restrictive clause and which contains the non-restrictive clause? I'll read them now. My friend who's Japanese will come to the party tonight. My friend who's Japanese will come to the party tonight. From the short pauses in my speech and the commas in the sentence, we know that sentence B is non-restrictive. This must mean that sentence A is restrictive. But apart from being able to identify them, what is the difference between them in terms of meaning? What do we mean when we say that the first sentence constricts the meaning of the noun phrase, whereas the second doesn't, and only provides optional, extra information? This distinction is very confusing when we learn about the two types of relative clause for the first time. For me, the best way to understand the meaning difference between these two sentences is to create some context. Therefore, I will show you two different conversations for these two types of relative clause. We will firstly see the conversation for the restrictive relative clause. Remember that the two sentences are, my friend who's Japanese will come to the party tonight, and my friend who's Japanese will come to the party tonight. Are you coming to the party tonight? You can bring a friend. Okay, I will bring one of my foreign friends. Do you think my American friend or my Japanese friend would enjoy the party more? A lot of Japanese people are already coming to the party, so maybe your Japanese friend would like to meet them. Great. In that case, my friend who's Japanese, not my friend who's American, will come to the party tonight. Pause the video and try to work out the meaning that the restrictive relative clause contributes to the sentence. I will share my thoughts with you on the next screen. In this conversation, the restrictive relative clause is essential in order to understand the entity in the noun phrase, because it tells us exactly which friend is coming to the party. Therefore, if the relative clause is removed, my friend no longer means the speaker's specific Japanese friend. For example, if the friend's name is Yoko, then removing the relative clause, only saying, my friend will come to the party tonight, means that the noun phrase, my friend, no longer refers to Yoko. The noun phrase instead now has a more vague, generic meaning. Also, in terms of the context of the conversation, you could also say that the relative clause emphasizes the difference between the Japanese friend and the American friend. Therefore, the restrictive relative clause makes it very clear that it is the Japanese friend, not the American friend, who will come. Here is another conversation. Are you coming to the party tonight? Yeah, I'll bring a friend if that's okay. No problem. Great. By the way, she is Japanese. So, just to confirm, my friend, who's Japanese, will come to the party tonight. Pause the video and try to work out the meaning that the non-restrictive relative clause contributes to the sentence. And I will share my thoughts with you soon. In contrast, in this conversation, the non-restrictive relative clause does not constrain the meaning of the noun phrase, as it simply tells us extra information about the friend. This means that, if you remove the relative clause, my friend still refers to the same person, so the noun phrase still means the Japanese friend. In conclusion then, in the following two sentences, my friend, who's Japanese, will come to the party tonight, and my friend will come to the party tonight, the noun phrase, my friend, refers to the same entity, because the non-restrictive relative clause is not essential to determine the meaning of the noun phrase. So, removing it means we lose a bit of the detailed information about the friend, but the fundamental meaning of the person in the noun phrase stays the same. Let's look at two more examples. For each one, I will provide some context for the possible scenarios in which these sentences might be spoken. The first example is, my neighbor who is an English teacher plays very loud music. And, my neighbor who is an English teacher plays very loud music. Based on your knowledge of the differences between the two types of relative clause, please pause the video and work out the different meanings of these two sentences, and then I will share my thoughts with you. Here is some context in which to understand these sentences. For the restrictive relative clause, my neighbor who is an English teacher plays very loud music. Imagine that I have two neighbors. One neighbor is an English teacher, whereas the other is a bus driver. The English teacher plays very loud music, whereas the bus driver is very quiet. Therefore, my neighbor who is an English teacher, not my neighbor who is a bus driver, plays very loud music. From this, you can see that the restrictive relative clause is useful to distinguish between two options. In this case, the two neighbors. In contrast, for the non-restrictive relative clause, my neighbor, who is an English teacher, plays very loud music. It simply means that my neighbor always plays very loud music. Also, he is an English teacher. Therefore, removing the relative clause in sentence A fundamentally damages the meaning of my neighbor, because we no longer know which neighbor the speaker is talking about. Therefore, the relative clause determines the meaning of the noun phrase, because it provides the essential information of which neighbor is playing loud music. But for the non-restrictive relative clause, we can assume that the speaker only has one neighbor, so it is not essential to explain which neighbor is playing loud music. Instead, the purpose of the relative clause is to provide additional information to the listener about the neighbor. Here is a final example. The librarian who works in the university library will visit us today. The librarian who works in the university library will visit us today. Like before, please pause the video and work out the different meanings of these two sentences, and then I will share my thoughts with you. The possible context in which the first sentence might be spoken is: we wanted to invite the librarian from the city library to visit us, but she was not available. Therefore, the librarian from the university library, not the librarian from the city library, will visit us today. You can again see that restrictive relative clauses make it clear exactly what the entity in the noun phrase is, or in this case, who the person is. This usually happens when contrasting two entities. Finally, for the non-restrictive relative clause, the librarian, who works in the university library, will visit us today. The context is probably, the librarian will visit us today. By the way, she works in the university library. Thus, in this context, there is no need to determine exactly which entity is referred to in the noun phrase. Instead, the librarian will always be the university librarian, no matter whether the relative clause is removed or not. We've touched upon some of the main differences between restrictive relative clauses and non-restrictive relative clauses throughout this section. But to finish, I will list all the important differences here. There are three key ones. Firstly, to reiterate, in writing, a non-restrictive relative clause is usually separated from the main clause by punctuation. So far, all the examples we have seen used commas to separate the non-restrictive relative clause from the main clause. However, two other types of punctuation can be used: dashes and parentheses. You can see these three types in the examples on the screen. My neighbor, who is an English teacher, plays very loud music. The man, whose name is John, also likes to have weekend parties. These parties, which are very rowdy, seem to happen all night. If these three types of punctuation are used to separate the relative clause, then it is a non-restrictive relative clause. And remember that, in speech, we use pauses to separate the relative clause. The second major difference between the two types of clause is that, in terms of meaning, restrictive relative clauses are tightly connected to the noun phrase that they modify, whereas non-restrictive clauses feel more separate from the noun phrase. This sounds very abstract, so it's best demonstrated with an example. And the best example is a sentence which contains two relative clauses. We haven't seen any examples of this yet, but it is certainly possible in English. When both a restrictive and a non-restrictive relative clause are connected to the same noun phrase within a sentence, the restrictive clause always comes first, because it must be closest to the noun phrase. Therefore, because the meaning of the restrictive relative clause is more directly connected to the main clause, the relative clause is closer to the noun phrase, compared to the non-restrictive relative clause. Here is an example. The person who left this bag, who must be very careless, will probably come back to get it. Pause the video and have a think about the closeness of the first relative clause, which is the restrictive one, compared to the second relative clause, in terms of the meaning that they contribute to the sentence. Regarding the previous example, here is the sentence without the non-restrictive relative clause. The person who left this bag will probably come back to get it. If we remove the non-restrictive relative clause, the sentence still makes sense, and the fundamental meaning of the noun phrase is the same. So the sentence still refers to the same person. However, the sentence sounds like this when the restrictive relative clause is removed. The person, who must be very careless, will probably come back to get it. Most importantly, if the restrictive clause is removed, then the sentence doesn't make sense. Secondly, the meaning of the noun phrase completely changes. Or, in other words, we no longer know whether the person who is referred to in the noun phrase is the same person, because it isn't specifically the person who left this bag. It is just a random person. Finally, the third difference is that, in general, restrictive relative clauses are shorter than non-restrictive relative clauses. You can see this in the most recent example. The restrictive relative clause is 4 words, whereas the non-restrictive relative clause is 5. Before we move to the final section of this episode, let's do an activity. You will see a text. The relative clauses are underlined. Pause the video and decide whether each underlined clause is restrictive or non-restrictive. I have a friend who was born in France, which always surprises people because he doesn't look French. His mother, who was English, and his father, whom he never met, were both working in France just before the war. There were many foreigners who couldn't leave the country, most of which was in chaos, when the war broke out. There was nothing that his mother could do. She eventually had a healthy baby, which was a miracle in the circumstances. But the father, who had gone on a field trip, was never seen again. Mother and baby managed to survive with the help of some people who risked their lives in those terrible times. Please pause the video. And here are the answers. I'll talk through the answers in order. The first relative clause is restrictive because it refers to a specific friend, the one who was born in France. Thus, without it, we wouldn't know exactly which friend is being referred to. So, the relative clause determines the meaning of the noun phrase. The next clause is non-restrictive because it is just extra information. The next 2 relative clauses are non-restrictive because we have only one mother and father. So there is not a contrast between the mother who was English and the mother who was French, for example. Instead, these clauses are just extra information. The next clause is restrictive because we are talking specifically about the foreigners who couldn't leave. The next clause is non-restrictive because it is again extra detail. It is not necessary to understand the noun phrase, the country. The next one, that his mother could do, is restrictive because it is essential information. After this, the clause about the miracle is non-restrictive because there was not another baby which wasn't a miracle. The next clause is non-restrictive because there was not another father who didn't go on a field trip. Finally, the last clause is restrictive because the sentence is specifically discussing the people who risked their lives. Thus, there was probably a group of people who didn't help, and thus who didn't risk their lives. So the distinction is necessary in order to constrain the meaning of the noun phrase to the specific group of people being discussed. We've now arrived at the final section of this episode, in which we'll discuss the basic meanings behind the relative pronouns and the contexts they should be used in. The place to begin when discussing the meanings of the relative pronouns, and which types of relative clauses they should be used in, is with the most basic semantic distinction: the difference between human entities, or at least very similar to human, and non-human entities. By non-human, I do not necessarily mean non-living, because most of the time this includes animals and inanimate objects. Regarding the actual pronouns to use for these two contexts, we often say that who and whom are used for human or human-like entities, and which is used for non-human entities. Notice that I said human or human-like. The reason for this will become clear soon. Let's begin with a question. Look at these 6 sentences. 4 of them are typical and unremarkable, but pay attention to D and F. Mary is a woman who loves her life. She has a boyfriend whom she adores. She has a group of friends whose company she enjoys. She has a crazy dog which makes her laugh. Or, she has a crazy dog who makes her laugh. And she has a new job which she finds exciting. But she also has an old car which can cause small problems, and a new boss who may be the source of some big problems. Or, but she also has an old car that can cause small problems, and a new boss that may be the source of some big problems. As you can see, in D and F, there are options about which pronouns to use. Pause the video and think about why there is a choice of pronoun in these 2 sentences. In sentence D, the noun phrase to which the relative clause refers is a dog. In terms of the relationship between the dog and the person in the sentence, it is clear that it is not a random dog. Instead, it is a pet dog. Thus, the choice of whether to use who or which depends on how much we perceive a family pet as part of the family. If we view it more like a child, then we can use the human pronoun. But if we perceive it more like any other animal, then use which. In sentence F, that is used for reference which are human, a new boss, and non-human, an old car. As we've previously learned, that is a more flexible pronoun which has fewer rules on its use. So this makes sense. Overall, the sentences on the previous screen demonstrate that the rules for the use of relative pronouns are flexible, and are sometimes more complicated than the basic difference between human and non-human entities. In the first section of this episode, we discussed the basic meanings of the common relative pronouns who, which, and that. In this section, we will add some additional sections about these 3 relative pronouns. Afterwards, I will introduce 3 less common relative pronouns: when, where, and why. These 3 are sometimes called relative adverbs. The relative pronoun who is used for individual humans. By this, I mean nouns which refer specifically to a person or to people. Thus, who refers to both singular and plural human nouns. You can see this in the 2 examples on the screen. Sentence A is connected to a singular noun, whereas sentence B refers to a plural noun. The man who gave me ice cream is very nice. I get tired of people who always complain. In contrast, which is used when the antecedent of the relative pronoun is a noun phrase that refers to groups of humans. These are called collective nouns. Look at the example in sentence A. I was part of the group which was waiting for the bus. The collective noun here is the group, so the relative pronoun must be which. It sounds very strange to say, I was part of the group who was waiting for the bus. Here is another example. However, there was a teenage gang which just wanted to cause trouble. The collective noun is gang, which refers to a group of people,
so it is ungrammatical to say, however, there was a teenage gang who just wanted to cause trouble. As we learned in a previous section, it is possible to use that instead of who or which in informal spoken English. For example, my sister has a baby that cries all night, and I only eat food that is delicious. However, as I said before, I do not recommend this in formal contexts. One reason for this is that removes a lot of grammatical information that is provided by the more grammatically desirable pronouns. This is a problem because formal contexts usually contain longer, more complicated sentences with more difficult vocabulary. So intentionally removing grammatical information, which is helpful to understand the meaning of the overall sentence, is counterproductive. The two pieces of grammatical information provided by these pronouns, compared to that, are the difference between who and which is the difference between human and non-human, and the difference between who and whom, which is the difference between whether the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the subject or the object of the relative clause. Of course, it is worth noting that having no relative pronoun at all, which is possible if you use a zero relative pronoun, removes all of the grammatical information which a relative pronoun provides, even more so than using that. In easy sentences, with few words and simple vocabulary, there is no problem with using that or a zero relative pronoun. However, there are two situations in which who, whom, and which must be used instead of that or a zero relative pronoun. Firstly, in the general context of formal sentences with complicated vocabulary and a large number of words. And secondly, in the specific situation when there are words or phrases between the noun phrase and the start of the relative clause. This is an unusual situation, which we haven't seen so far in this episode, but it is possible and perfectly grammatical. Here is an example. I met a student yesterday in the canteen who said he knew you. The noun phrase and the relative clause are usually together, but in this sentence there are two pieces of information between them, an adverb and a prepositional phrase. Because of this, it sounds strange to say, I met a student yesterday in the canteen that said he knew you. The reason for this should be obvious. Interrupting the connection between the noun phrase and relative clause by putting words and phrases between them makes the grammatical link between them weaker and thus more difficult to understand. This is especially true when noun phrases are inserted between them, because now the listener has to work out which noun phrase the relative pronoun connects to. In this sentence, that could conceivably connect to a student or the canteen. All speakers will eventually understand that the relative clause connects to a student, but in a long and difficult sentence, you should give the listener as much information as possible to give him or her the best opportunity to understand the sentence. In other words, using a pronoun which lacks the grammatical distinction between human and non-human makes it slightly more difficult to understand this sentence, because two noun phrases, a human and a non-human, have appeared before the relative pronoun. In this situation, it is important to provide as much grammatical information as possible. So, if who is used, then the listener knows that it definitely connects to a student and not the canteen. Without it, the listener must use other grammatical information to understand the sentence, which slows down the speed at which the listener can understand it. Here is a final example. We should say, I wanted to talk about the problem with my parents which makes me sad. Not, I wanted to talk about the problem with my parents that makes me sad. Please pause the video and think about why we should use which in this sentence, and then I'll share my thoughts with you. We should use which in this complicated sentence because there is a significant distance between the noun phrase and the relative clause. Specifically, the prepositional phrase with my parents has interrupted them. Because of this, the connection between the noun phrase, the problem, and the relative pronoun, which, needs to be obvious. With two noun phrases before the relative pronoun, the listener needs more time to understand the sentence, because he or she needs to work out the correct antecedent of the relative pronoun. Therefore, as much grammatical information as possible is needed to help the listener understand the grammar of the whole sentence. Specifically, using that slows down the processing of the sentence, because the first noun phrase, the problem, is non-human, whereas the second noun phrase, my parents, is human. Using which makes it clear that the relative pronoun is connected to the first noun phrase, whereas using that removes all of the extra grammatical information that who and which provide. Let's now explore three less common relative pronouns: where, when, and why. Remember, these are sometimes called relative adverbs. We'll start with where. This relative pronoun is used to begin the relative clause when the antecedent of the relative pronoun is a location. Remember that by antecedent, I am referring specifically to the noun phrase in the second full sentence. This relative pronoun is rare because the antecedent of the relative pronoun is always a prepositional phrase, not a noun phrase. The location can either be concrete or literal, or abstract and metaphorical. Let's look at examples of these. Firstly, a concrete location. If we split it into two full sentences, we would say, he lives in the town. I was born in that town. When converted into a main clause and a relative clause, the underlined prepositional phrase in the second full sentence becomes the relative pronoun where. He lives in the town where I was born. Like with after preposition relative clauses, this is always a type of object relative clause, because prepositional phrases can never be the subject of a sentence. Now for an abstract location. As two full sentences, I grew up in an atmosphere. Everything was easy in that atmosphere. The prepositional phrase in the second sentence becomes the relative pronoun where. I grew up in an atmosphere where everything was easy. If you want to learn more about literal and metaphorical locations, then watch the episode in this series about prepositions. Before we continue, I should say that it is possible to use in which instead of where. I grew up in an atmosphere in which everything was easy. In this situation, the preposition is obviously kept, so only the noun phrase inside the prepositional phrase becomes the relative pronoun which. However, when where is the relative pronoun, the entire prepositional phrase becomes the relative pronoun. Next, if the antecedent of the relative pronoun is a time, then the relative clause can start with when. Like before, the antecedent of the relative pronoun is always a prepositional phrase, not only the noun phrase. For example, the problem started during the period. I was a teenager during that period. This becomes, the problem started during the period when I was a teenager. For this type of relative clause, you can also use in which instead of when. And finally, if the antecedent of the relative pronoun is the reason for something, the relative clause can start with why. The antecedent is again always a prepositional phrase. For example, that's probably the major reason. I left the place for that reason. This becomes, that's probably the major reason why I left that place. For this type of relative clause, you cannot use in which instead of why. This is the end of the episode about relative clauses. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more episodes in my English grammar series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.